Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm going to give it a minute or so to allow for more people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable homes. I'm Diane Yantel, President and CEO of the National Income Housing Coalition, and I'm glad to have you all back. We took a break for about 2 months, both for our bi-weekly Our Homes, Our Votes 2022 webinars, which continue to take place every other Monday at 2:30 Eastern Time through the elections. So I encourage you all to continue participating in those webinars. And we also took a break from our HoUSed campaign calls in order to have a 4-part webinar series on housing first and homelessness, which NLIHC co-hosted together with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And we were so pleased by the level of interest and support for those webinars. We regularly had anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people registering for those webinars. We had over 2,000 people participating live and more watching the recordings of those webinars. If you missed or you want to rewatch any of those webinars, you can find them on our website. We did a recap. Elena just put it in the chat box. Thank you, Elena. We have a recap of each of the webinars and a link to the videos, so you can watch them there. And we're going to be continuing to co-host now monthly Housing First and Homelessness webinars. Again, it'll be NLIHC, the Alliance to End Homelessness, and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, co-hosting those together, beginning on Monday, December 12th, and then monthly after that. And those webinars will be held in lieu of a HoUSed campaign call for that week. So they will also be held on Mondays at 2:30 Eastern once a month. So we're back now with our regular bi-weekly HoUSed campaign calls, and we've all certainly been busy during the HoUSed webinar break, but it's really good to be back and to gear up for a final push for housing investments this year, potentially through tax extenders legislation and or appropriations. And to keep these webinars going so that we can continue to discuss all of the need and the case for the long-term solutions. So we're going to start actually with the latter, and then we'll end with the former. We'll hear at the end of the agenda from Sarah Sadian about some of the legislative opportunities and actions we need to take in the next couple of months. So we'll dive right into the agenda now. And I want to remind everybody that as our speakers share updates and information, you can feel free to ask questions via the Q&A box. You can put them in the chat box technically, but much preferred if you put them in the Q&A box so we can keep track of them a little bit more easily. And our speakers, I'll ask some of the questions to our speakers live, and then throughout the call, they may answer some of them on their own via the Q&A box, and any questions that we're not able to get to during the call, we'll follow up and get answers out to everybody afterwards. So I'm going to introduce our first 2 speakers, Rashida Phillips and Jasmine Rangel from PolicyLink. Rashida is Director of Housing at PolicyLink, and Jasmine is Senior Housing Associate, and I'm really glad to welcome them both back to our national call to talk today about an anti-displacement toolkit that they've created and that we want to share widely. So Rashida and Jasmine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Rangel. I'm, like Diane mentioned, I'm a senior associate at PolicyLink, and I'm joined here today with my colleague Rashida Phillips, who's Director of Housing at PolicyLink. Thank you so much to NLIHC for the opportunity to share a little bit about what we've been doing and working on with the All in Cities toolkit. Next slide, please. Great. So just a bit of background and just some framing for our conversation today in this presentation. We've seen decades of decline in cities across the country. Cities have lost residents, jobs, and have moved their investments to the suburbs. And while some cities have been lauded as a comeback story where they're captivating young people and innovative companies with their diversity, density, and social opportunities, it might not be the full story. It's been 7 years since PolicyLink launched the All in Cities initiative in 2015, and the question that guided this initiative is increasingly more important to consider given our current economic uncertainties. For whom are cities coming back for? Too many low-income people, especially people of color, still struggle to get by in neighborhoods that put their health and livelihoods at risk, or face displacement altogether as their rents are continuing to rise and their wages continue to stagnate all over the country. As America continues to undergo profound demographic shifts amidst rising inequality, persistent racial inequities, and an economy that's being continuously transformed by technology, equity has now become a moral imperative, a potent antidote to inequality, and the path to an inclusive economy. The All in Cities initiative believes that with the right set of policy solutions and partnerships, a laser focus on achieving measurable results, cities can deliver greater economic opportunity and security for their low wealth residents, creating stronger and more vibrant cities for all. And this past September, we've updated our housing and anti-displacement toolkit to reflect the current state of anti-displacement best practices across the country. Next slide, please. And to give you a bit of background on our approach, the All in Cities initiative was guided by blending values of racial equity, equitable growth, and community power to achieve systems change. The All in Cities toolkit is just one part of this and aims to illuminate best practices around key strategies for areas that can advance racial equity, including economic security, democracy and justice, and many more. Today, we'll be reviewing important strategies around housing and anti-displacement. Our hope is that these tools can inspire and motivate advocates such as yourself and policymakers with actionable strategies to advance racial equities in your community. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as we all know, housing is the linchpin for opportunity. The location and quality of the home you can afford not only affect your living space and your household budget, it determines your quality of schools, the length of your commute, your health outcomes, and much more. Housing anti-displacement tools work to expand housing opportunities and prevent displacement of low-income communities of color. And currently, our tools cover 3 key strategies to promote healthy housing futures. They first review ways to increase affordability by expanding and preserving affordability through inclusionary zoning and housing trust funds. Our tools also promote investments in policies that support opportunity housing by ensuring public policies and investments foster healthy, economically integrated neighborhoods and community ownership with policies such as tenant opportunity to purchase and community opportunity to purchase, community land trusts, and housing trust funds. And finally, our tools illustrate ways to protect tenants by ensuring the security of tenants and prevent their displacement through legal representation, just cause legal protections, rental registries, and rent stabilization. I think it's been put in the chat, but I can put it in again for anyone here, a link to our anti-displacement toolkit. But during this last update, we've added 2 new tools to our toolkit, rental registries and rent stabilization. So I highly encourage you to check them out, especially some of those new ones, if you're interested in them. But I would love to turn it over to Rashida to tell us more about our available tools.
Thank you, Jasmine. Next slide, please. So Jasmine already highlighted a few of the tools, but we have a total of 8 tools that are available in the anti-displacement toolkit. So the 8 tools that are there are right to counsel for tenants, housing trust funds, just cause, rent stabilization, community land trusts, inclusionary zoning, rental registries, and a tool on tenant opportunity to purchase or community opportunity to purchase policies, otherwise known as TOPA-COPA. And as Jasmine noted, we're also exploring additional tools that we can add to the toolkit. So we are planning to add a tool in the next few months on sealing eviction records and tenant screening policies. Next slide, please. So each of the tools contains a few key categories and areas. So each tool is going to have 4 important sections to understand the policy and key stakeholders, how to pursue that particular policy, and what considerations are important, as well as where the tool is working well. So if you go, you navigate your way to the anti-displacement toolkit, you'll see the 8 tools that I named earlier there, and then you can click on each tool, and each tool will have a similar section that navigates you again through what it is, who implements it, where it's working, and what are the key considerations for that particular policy. Also, the section is going to talk about what are the complementary policies that work together to enhance, anti-displacement and housing protections. And so, for example, although each of the tools are individual tools like Just Cause, right, it will have a link or relation to a policy like rent stabilization and rental registries, and understanding the ways in which these policies can work together. And then additionally, we've expanded the function of resources available to each tool by adding in a related tools section to the right of each tool page. So there you'll be able to find additional resources from PolicyLink, as well as important related tools that can help complement the policies that you're looking at. And so with this example that I'm showing you up here for the TOPA-COPA policies, again, also known as tenant and community opportunity to purchase policies, you can see the related tools to be housing trust funds, community land trusts, and inclusionary zoning that are complements, if not critical additional policies for pursuing tenant and community opportunity to purchase policies. In addition, with this particular tool, the TOPA-COPA tool, we have also built out a map that shows you where these policies are emerging or where there are campaigns related to TOPA-COPA. So for that particular tool, that's the only one that we have that map built out, but we're exploring ways to build out other similar policy tools that will enhance the particular tool, as well as I said, we link to other additional resources. So for example, a policy like Right to Counsel for tenants, right, we're going to link to, National Low Income Housing Coalition or National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel, which does have, for example, maps and additional resources around where Right to Counsel policies are happening and where they're popping up. So next slide, please. I think that's it. Actually, that's the end. We'll take some any questions you may have, and then thank you, Jasmine and Kim, for popping the links for the anti-displacement toolkit into the chat.
Great, thanks so much, Rashida and Jasmine. That's really great information and very helpful toolkit. Appreciate the work that went into it and appreciate you sharing it today. Looking for some questions. One was asking about how many communities have the TOPA or COPA requirements and what resources are needed to bring this work to scale.
That's such a great question. So if you take a look at the map that we have, and we'll make sure we post the link to the map specifically, you'll see that there's about 12 places around the country. A lot of them are concentrated in California. We have some that are concentrated in Maryland and DC area. So you'll see on the map that there's a few places, there's maybe 2 or 3 places that have statewide TOPA-COPA policies, and then a few places that are local places. But the great thing that we're seeing with this policy is that it's emerging and it's more and more places are adopting it. And we've also done a policy scan on TOPA-COPA policy. So you can take a look at that map, and that map will give you some additional details about what the TOPA-COPA policy looks like in that area. But we have a deeper policy scan for advocates, and you can email us if you want to see that policy scan that gives you more information about where those policies are happening, what the campaign is around it, who was the opposition for that particular campaign, right? So it gets into some of those details that we don't necessarily want to be externally facing, but that we want to provide to advocates who are working on these policies and trying to figure out how to scale them up. To the question of how we scale them up, right? Again, we're seeing these policies emerge different places. We're also seeing the conversation around them. So things like social housing, community ownership, right? These are starting to become more emergent values in how people are thinking about these policies and how they bring them into their campaigns and into their communities. And so we would be happy to talk about that. We're hoping also to do a webinar on Topa Copa in the future, but please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to me or to Jasmine if you want to have more of a conversation about like where are these Topa Copa policies happening, if you want access to our policy scan and you want to get into more, how do I bring this into my community? How do we scale this up to a larger national level? The last thing I'll add is that we are also looking at through some of the coalition spaces that we're a part of, particularly Alliance for Housing Justice. We're looking at mapping federal resources that can help support these kind of campaigns in communities. So thinking about how can CDBG funds, for example, be used to support Topa Copa campaigns in particular communities. So that's another thing that we're looking at and utilizing this toolkit to sort of bring out some of those elements that people can focus on.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rashida. There's another question from Ina Fenderson asking if there's anything that addresses the credit score discrimination issue for tenants.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
Oh, I was just going to say that's a great question, and I think a topic that we will be focusing in on in 2023 when we release another one on eviction sealing records and tenant screening protections. So good prompt. We will just watch out for that update in 2023.
Great, and another question from Susan Beck Furcus, who asks, when you say housing trust fund, do you mean just more revenue?
Well, yeah, so the way that we constructed the Housing Trust Fund Toolkit, we look at the Federal Housing Trust Fund and how it's used as a mechanism to support and fund local housing trust funds, but we're looking at housing trust funds as a program, right, as a mechanism for creating more affordable housing in communities, and also thinking about how housing trust funds can go beyond just building or creating new affordable housing, but how it can serve a community at large, right, and can serve some of those other elements that go into, right, we know how affordable housing is not just its own thing, but in terms of thinking about how we have better access to jobs, how we have better access to grocery stores. I think housing trust funds have often been seen as limited to the building itself or creating more affordable housing. But we can also think about it in a more expansive sense in terms of how it can support communities at large, right? So that's how we tried to frame it in the Housing Trust Fund Toolkit, but would be happy to have more of that conversation, or if you have other examples of ways that we should uplift what a housing trust fund can do.
Great, lots of compliments in the chat and Q&A box on the slides and how colorful and beautiful they are. There's a question from Pam Hill asking, are there cities or states that integrate Topa Copa with federal state funded financing?
Yes, I think so, right? And again, I think what we tried to do with the toolkit, right, was figure out the ways that we can connect these different policies. So definitely, right, there's been housing trust funds that can support Topa Copa, that can support tenants being able to purchase the properties, right? Because we all know that that is often the hardest part of being able to fulfill a Topa Copa policy or program, is that people just don't have the funding. So thinking about how housing trust funds, how different federal funding mechanisms can be used to support Topa Copa policies is something that we try to accomplish in that toolkit. But again, the toolkit doesn't say everything, right? It kind of is a high level look at some of these tools. So again, if folks are interested in going a little bit deeper into Topa Copa, what are the funding mechanisms? What are the different ways that people have actually created these policies and been able to successfully enforce them and utilize them? We would be happy to talk and share that deeper policy scan. So feel free to reach out to us.
There's quite a few more questions and comments coming in. I'll ask you one more for now. And this question comes from Mary Pattern, who asks, do you have anything about preserving mobile home parks as affordable housing?
That is a great question. We do not highlight that specifically in our toolkit. But would be happy to have a conversation about how we can include that specifically. I mean, I think, again, we can go into how these policies can serve that sort of specific area of housing, right? But our toolkit doesn't highlight that in particular. So would be happy to get more into that, or if folks think that it is a very specific area that we should highlight or uplift in our toolkit, would be happy to figure out some resources that we can put towards that particular question. Thank you for asking that.
Great. Thanks so much, Rashida and Jasmine. Again, thanks for your work. Thanks for joining to share it today. if you're able to stay on and check out the chat and Q&A box and respond to some of the remaining questions and comments, that'd be great. But I appreciate you both. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.
Take care. Okay, next on the agenda, we have Alison Pavel-Amon from Children's Health Watch and Stephanie Ettinger de Cuba, who is Executive Director of Children's Health Watch. And they're here to talk about some important new research that they've done on eviction, household health, and hardships in families with very young children. So Stephanie and Alison, thanks so much for joining, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for having us, Diane, and the NLIHC team. We're pleased to be here. We're excited to share some new research that we just published last month in the journal Pediatrics. So if you could just go to the next slide. The title of our paper is Evictions and Household Health and Hardships Among Families with Young Children. So next slide. Tell you a little bit about who we are and sort of the foundation for this research. So Children's Health Watch, we're a network of pediatricians and public health researchers, and our work is really focused on advancing child health equity among families with young children by advancing research to transform policy. We're headquartered at Boston Medical Center, but we have data collection sites in 5, for this study, we collected data in 5 US cities: Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, and Little Rock. Our Baltimore site, fortunately, stopped data collection last year, but we still have nearly 25 years of data collection from that site. So next slide. You know, we've shown for, over 2 decades now, really the connection between housing stability and child health. And so this research is really building upon our previous research that really makes these linkages. So if you could go to the next slide. This is a graphic from another researcher, Lauren Taylor, on a policy brief she wrote for the journal Health Affairs, but I think really shows sort of an overview of how the medical literature connects housing and health. So we have issues of stability, families moving around or experiencing homelessness on the sort of extreme end, quality and safety, which tends to be people's first thought when they think about the connection between housing and health, given the robust knowledge we have around things like mold and asthma and lead paint poisoning among children. But we also know that things like affordability, which we'll talk about a little bit more during this presentation, and neighborhood and the investment in communities has on health outcomes and healthcare utilization. Next slide. So I know I'm talking to a housing audience here, and so you know these things well, but I like to remind people that sometimes when we think about housing stability and sort of the problem of housing stability in our country, people often think about the issue of homelessness, which is indeed an incredibly troubling and associated with poor health outcomes. But below the surface, we have much bigger iceberg of housing instability, families who are moving frequently, who are falling behind on rent, who are experiencing eviction. And really, at the base of all of that is, just structural racism and unaffordable housing and decades-long disinvestment in communities and housing resources. Next slide. So again, I keep coming back to just foundational look at how housing instability affects health across the lifespan. So housing instability has been shown to impact key factors, key indicators of health and well-being from the prenatal period. Our own research has shown that experiences of housing instability and homelessness in the prenatal period are associated with preterm birth and low birth weight, as well as pregnancy complications. Early childhood effects on developmental delays, so children not meeting those important cognitive milestones, poor overall health and hospitalizations throughout childhood and adolescence, adverse educational outcomes, as well as poor mental and behavioral health, and then into adulthood, where we see indications of housing instability linked to poor general health, anxiety and depression, and increased need of urgent health services. Next slide. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Stephanie, our Executive Director now, to share the findings from our newest study that we just published on evictions.
Everybody, great to be with you. As Alison said, this just came out. So hot off the presses, kind of. The goal of our study was to examine associations between having an experience of eviction, so whether it was formal or informal, in the past 5 years, and a variety of health and material hardship outcomes. The population that we have in our data set is all families with children under the age of 4, so very young children. The data for this study came from 2011 to 2019. So these are all pre-pandemic, is all pre-pandemic data. We'll talk more about that at the end. And we interview families in pediatric emergency rooms and primary care sites, again, in the 5 cities that Alison already mentioned. And in those settings, predominantly pick up families with low income. So over 90% of the kids in this sample were publicly insured. We can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So the measures for this study, the way we measured eviction was actually using a question adapted from Matt Desmond's work, the author of Evicted. It was a self-report question about any experience of eviction, whether formal or informal, in the past 5 years, and then goes on to ask a little bit more detail so that we could then determine whether it was a formal or an informal eviction. Formal evictions are defined by any legal action taken by the landlord to remove a tenant, and informal evictions as landlord actions that remove a tenant but don't use legal action. And then on the outcome side, we looked at a variety of child health outcomes, their overall physical health, their development, so whether they were, learning and moving the way that they should for their age. A measure that looks at admission to the hospital after a visit to the ER. So essentially kind of a signal that the child was sick enough that they needed to be hospitalized after that ER visit. And then on the parental health side, we looked at overall physical health and maternal depressive symptoms. And then we looked at a variety of household hardships. So, and looked at each of these individually. Food insecurity, housing instability. We looked at 3 different conditions of housing instability: homelessness, behind on rent, and multiple moves. Energy insecurity, so difficulty affording utilities. A measure we have called healthcare hardships, which looks at what maybe the families had foregone care because they couldn't afford it, or conversely, they paid for medical care that made it hard then to pay for other needs. And then lastly, a measure, also the one that we've developed called childcare constraints, that looks at whether someone had difficulty or didn't get to work or study as much as they would have liked to or needed to because they had difficulty obtaining childcare. And all of those have been previously associated with poor health. So what did we find? We found that formal and informal evictions place families at risk of poor health and increased hardship. So families with a history of eviction compared to our families that did not experience eviction in the last 5 years were 5 times more likely to experience homelessness, 3 to 4 times more likely to experience multiple forms of housing instability. And I think really want to highlight too the health outcomes here, that the children were more likely to be in poor health and have be at developmental risk. Mothers were also more likely to report depressive symptoms. We can go to the next slide. So again, they're linked to multiple hardships. So previous research that we and many others have done have linked all of these things to poor health outcomes in and of themselves. So we know that first of all, these are terrible experiences, but second of all, that each of these has a cascade of health outcomes that come with them. So we found that compared to families that had never been evicted, families that were evicted in the past 5 years were more likely to experience multiple moves, being behind on rent, periods of homelessness, food insecurity, energy insecurity. So again, that's the utilities access, childcare constraints, and healthcare hardships. And we looked at it, each of these individually as formal evictions. So looking at associations with formal evictions and looking at informal evictions, the The risk for each of these was very, very similar, and it really didn't matter what kind of eviction you had, so we combined them. So while the solutions are really different, we'll talk about that in a second, the risk to health and to families experiencing hardship wasn't different. Go to the next slide. So what are the implications? Again, formal and informal evictions increase the risk of hardship and adverse health outcomes. And I think this also calls attention to the fact, since 43% of the evictions in our data set were informal evictions, it calls attention to the fact that informal evictions are really undercounted in national data sets and other studies that rely just on court data. And we found the rate of evictions in our study sample were 2 times higher than contemporary national rates. And as I mentioned, the data were collected pre-pandemic, so the magnitude of eviction prevalence and impact may certainly have increased since that we collected this data. Obviously, we've had the pandemic and huge number of evictions, and then also people at risk of eviction. And so really underscores the fact that evictions have lasting impacts on families with children. And you guys are the experts here, but robust policy solutions are really urgently needed to reduce evictions, to promote housing stability, and to advance health equity. So thank you all very much. We can go to the next slide. There's the link there to the full study if anyone would like to look at the details, and our contact information too.
Great, Stephanie and Allison, thanks so much. Really appreciate this important research and appreciate you sharing it today. We do have a few questions. The first that I'll ask is, what was the prevalence of informal evictions in your study compared to formal evictions?
So the overall rate of evictions was about 4%, and half were informal and about half were formal. So just looked at the exact rate. It was 1.7% were informal and 2.2% were formal evictions. And to the second question that was also in the Q&A, sort of building on that one, I think it was typed before Stephanie made this point, but we looked at the informal and formal evictions separately and did not find significant differences in the outcomes outlined.
Thanks, Allison. I'm just looking in the in the chat to see if there's other questions there. I see some comments and thanks to you both and questions about the slides, which everybody will receive. So there's one last question about the advocacy, housing advocacy needed to prevent and solve for these evictions, and how other healthcare organizations are engaging in housing advocacy at all, and how you're interacting with them, and how we can do more to have more healthcare advocates engaged in housing advocacy.
Thank you for that question. I think I will make a plug for the NLHC-led Opportunity Starts at Home campaign on the advocacy front and really engaging cross-sector partners, including healthcare partners, in this work. I think it's incredibly important to have the health voice there, and appreciate working with the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign and in doing that. I think to the first question around what healthcare organizations are doing around housing, this is certainly, given the growing body of evidence around housing instability and homelessness, for not only impacting health outcomes, but also healthcare utilization and cost, there has been a large and growing movement among healthcare organizations to invest and to invest in housing solutions, as well as identify ways to identify patients who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of eviction or homelessness and provide wraparound supports from them. And so the group that I think is really trying to convene healthcare systems around this, around these types of initiatives is called the Healthcare Anchor Network, where they have as one of their pillars of commitment for healthcare organizations they have a pillar around housing and really starting to think about how can healthcare institutions invest in affordable housing solutions and policies within their communities in order to promote stability and advance health equity.
Great, thanks for that, Allison, and thanks for the plug for Opportunity Starts at Home. I didn't plant that question. But thank you, Allison and Stephanie, so much for the research, for all of your great work, and for your partnership, and thanks for joining here today.
Thank you.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Okay, we'll move on now to talk about ERA and our Erase project to end rent arrears to stop eviction. We have two NLHC colleagues joining to give some different updates related to ERA. And I'm going to first turn to Sarah Gallagher, who is our Erase Senior Project Director, to give a recap of the Erase convening that we had just last week here in DC, and which I think many of you were participating in either in person or virtually. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks Diane, and thanks for, I was going to say the same thing. I'm looking at some of the names and know many folks were able to join us either in person or online. So this will be both a recap and a teaser for those of you who weren't able to join, because we will be posting a full video recording of the convening online, hopefully later this week, and we'll be sending that out to you and then have it available on our Erase website. So yes, so early last week on October 17th, we were able to get together both in person virtually in DC to really talk about where we are with emergency rental assistance. This convening was a culmination of all of our collective work over the last 2 years, implementing emergency rental assistance and ensuring emergency rental assistance gets to the most marginalized, lowest income renters in time to prevent eviction. As folks know, over the last 2 years, more than 500 different ERA programs were set up across the country. And as of June, about 7 million payments had gone out to landlords and households. And this is really a new infrastructure, national infrastructure that was set up. And so we really wanted to get folks together to really talk about where we were with emergency rental assistance, what did the new infrastructure look like, and what is really needed to sustain the infrastructure as well as related tenant protections as we are winding down emergency rental assistance in many communities. As you know, many communities have already run out of money, and several will stop having money well before the statutory deadlines. And so this was really an opportunity to look at all of the information that was gathered, talk to policymakers, talk to researchers, talk to tenants, talk to community-based organizations, as well as program administrators, to really bring together all of those highlights, lessons learned, and what does the future look like for emergency rental assistance. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this was a hybrid event. It was actually a 2-day event where in the first day we had a national convening that was open to the public. On the second day, we really dove into 2 areas with our Erase cohort, which you've heard from many times throughout the last year. We had 5 panels that were really organized around different perspectives of stakeholders who were working on or receiving emergency rental assistance, more than 23 guest speakers, 270 people registered in person and over 1,600 online. And we were at capacity in the room, and I think that we had more than around 1,000 people who did join us online. And on day 2, we were able to have some really deep dive discussions to really focus in on what does it take to sustain emergency rental assistance? What are the different components that different communities are looking at? What funding sources are being leveraged, and what is needed in terms of technical assistance and support to make that happen. And then another session on advancing tenant protections and sort of what are states and localities looking at in terms of tenant protections that have been most impactful over the past 2 years. What tenant protections would we like to sustain? And what would ideal tenant protections or packages look like at the state and local level? I think we've talked about in past calls, we've been tracking over 150 different state and local tenant protections that have been implemented since January 2021 in coordination with emergency rental assistance. And so there's a real opportunity to think about how those tenant protections will continue and how to scale those into more communities. Next slide. So our agenda for the convening, as you can see, was really broken out into different stakeholder groups. We were able to kick off the agenda sessions with our very own Diane Yantel, and then Jean Sperling from the Senior Advisor to the President of the United States, giving some opening remarks. And then we heard from program administrators who really represented the range of emergency rental assistance programs. So we had state programs, from Oregon and Virginia. We had a tribal program, Joey Nathan from the Northern Ponca Housing Authority, as well as Emilio Salas, who represented a county program in LA, and Ayanna Sins, who represented Philadelphia program, to really talk about what it took to implement ERA in different types of localities and what that really meant for their housing priorities moving forward. Then we looked at the latest research in emergency rental assistance, what we've been learning so far, what were some of the research questions that we still want to explore. And then we heard from tenants, people who had experienced and actually received emergency rental assistance, what that experience was like for them, how assistance could be helpful moving forward, and what would happen if there was another individual crisis or pandemic, and how to really make programs work more effectively for tenants and keep tenants in the forefront of that conversation. We had a session with our race cohort to talk about the role of community-based organizations who were sometimes hidden partners in emergency rental assistance, and really did a lot of work to knock on doors, to do education to both tenants and landlords, as well as influence programs and ensure the flexibilities were being implemented across the different programs. And we ended our session with a hearing from our federal partners. And what is the vision going forward at the federal level? And what are the items that the federal government is working on to sustain emergency rental assistance? So we talked about the Eviction Crisis Act. We talked about the Tenants' Bill of Rights that is being worked on. And we talked about some of the research that HUD is working on with the data set that is being compiled with the program data that is out there. So very full and rich day. We are currently working on summaries based on all of these different sessions that we hope to have available. But like I said before, will be a recording available in the next week or so that you'll be able to watch the sessions yourselves. Next slide. So I'll just end with a couple of key takeaways. These are not all the takeaways, but they're just sort of some of the highlights that we heard. One of them is really around, I mentioned before, that emergency rental assistance was the first time we built a national infrastructure around eviction prevention. And we really, across the board and across all our panels, realized that we can't go back to the way things were. We can't go back to the old normal. We have to create the new normal based on the infrastructure that we've built. And a real dedication, I think, from both state, from localities, from community members and federal government to really think about how do we go forward from here. When a research panel, we heard about, ERA is working to mediate back rent, to lower rental arrears, as well as to decrease anxiety among tenants. And so among the early findings, we're seeing that emergency rental assistance is having real impact for households who need it and receive it. We walked away, I think, with a shared understanding of what future programs could look like. We talked a lot about the intentional focus and program design to ensure equity and to reduce trauma among households. Emergency rental assistance was really, some of the early data coming out of Treasury shows the equitable distribution and of emergency rental assistance and the intentionality of that among program administrators to make that happen. We talked about sort of the need for infrastructure and staffing and capacity and making sure that that is maintained, as well as flexibilities and accessibility of program, both within emergency rental assistance, but also within other programs that tenants may be needing to access. And then the last thing we talked about on the shared understanding of what future programs should look like was really this idea that the future structure needs to build in flexibility for tenants to make decisions that help them the most. That the flexibility and direct attendant assistance really helping to have tenants make decisions on how they can be most benefited from the programs. The last two takeaways were around the need for state, local, and federal tenant protections. As I mentioned before, we've seen real momentum around tenant protections being passed since January 2021, and that has a momentum we want to keep going because the impact has been large across the country. And then the commitment to sustaining the programs and infrastructure that's been developed. I mentioned the Eviction Crisis Act. We talked about state and local fiscal recovery funds being used to bridge emergency rental assistance until other funds are available, as well as states and localities appropriating local dollars to continue the programs. And then the role of mayors, governors, and local officials to ensure that that happens and to keep that momentum going. So it was a really great conversation. It was wonderful to see everybody in person. And it was wonderful to have these very robust conversations. We look forward to more of them. You can go to the next slide and you'll see here is the website for our Erase project. And you can check in there because that's where we'll be posting the video when it's available. And like I said before, we will definitely put out the communication when it is available online. But thank you everyone. And we look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a great overview and great work again to you and to Tori and to everybody on NLHC's broader ERA team for all the work that led up to and went into the planning and the actual meeting. But Sarah, I'm going to ask you one question before you go that asks, what is the biggest barrier to continuing ERA programs in communities going forward, and what are states and localities doing to bridge the gap?
That's a really great question. Our research team has actually put a quick survey out to program administrators to ask what are the different components of emergency rental assistance that are being sustained moving forward. And I think what the obvious barrier is probably the funding. You know, $46 billion was an unprecedented amount of funding to go out to communities in such a short period of time, and that infusion was able to build up programs and investment in the infrastructure for ERA. So without that funding going forward, it's very difficult for programs to think about how to sustain that. Some of the ways they are thinking about sustaining their programs are through, as I mentioned, the state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars to bridge until other funds are available. Some programs are using state dollars or local dollars through appropriation processes. And then it's very important for us to be supporting the Eviction Crisis Act and other legislation to ensure that money is available going forward. But I would say that the lack of sustainable funding is probably the biggest barrier at this time.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate you joining to share the update. We'll see you again next time.
Bye.
I'm going to turn now to another NLHC colleague, Sophie Seibeck-Glover, who's a research specialist at NLHC, to talk about latest data on ERA spending and reallocation. Sophie, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Seibeck-Glover, and I will be giving a brief update on ERA spending and reallocation. Next slide. So Treasury has released quite a bit of spending and reallocation data recently, including spending progress through June 2022, data on ERA1 reallocation, ERA1 reallocation among tribal grantees, and ERA2 reallocation. Next slide. First, I'll give a brief overview of ERA spending through June. Overall, $31.8 billion in ERA funds have been dispersed to households. That's to cover things like rent and utilities, as well as admin expenses and housing stability services. Grantees have made over 6.3 million payments to households since ERA1 began in January 2021. In June, grantees dispersed just under $538 million to households, bringing the total amount of ERA spent to $20.9 billion. This is over 84% of all ERA1 funds available. Grantees dispersed nearly 997 million of ERA2 funds since 2021, and in total has spent nearly 51% of all ERA2 funds available. Next slide. This graph depicts the amount of ERA1 and ERA2 funds spent on assistance to households since the beginning of ERA1 in January 2021. So as you can see, ERA1 spending significantly increased during late spring and early summer 2021, and those are depicted by the darker blue bars. Since October 2021, ERA1 spending has decreased. Very little ERA2, which is depicted by the light blue bars, was spent between June and September 2021, but ERA2 spending drastically increased between October and November. ERA2 spending since has tapered off. Next slide. So the June monthly compliance report, which is what I just gave a brief overview on, is the last monthly spending report that grantees are required to submit. Grantees are still required to submit spending data quarterly. Treasury has yet to release quarterly data, but when they do, you all will be the first to know. Next slide. I'll now give a brief update on reallocation. And for folks who don't think about reallocation quite as much as I do, I just want to give a quick reminder that Treasury was statutorily required to reallocate ERA funds from grantees with excess funds to grantees in need of additional resources beginning in September 2021. So far, Treasury has released data on 3 rounds of ERA1 reallocation, 1 round of tribal reallocation, and 1 round of ERA2 reallocation. So since ERA1 reallocation began in 2021, nearly 2.9 billion of ERA1 funds have been reallocated. The amount of funds reallocated in each round has decreased, as you can see, with Treasury reallocating just under $710 million in the most recent round. Tribal grantees were not subject to reallocation until April 2022, and recently released data indicates that just over $35 million was reallocated from tribal grantees. Next slide. The majority of reallocated ERA1 funds were reallocated voluntarily, meaning that grantees that transferred funds were able to identify a recipient. So over $1.9 billion was voluntarily reallocated, and in most cases, this meant that funds were reallocated from the state grantee to a local or a tribal grantee within the same state. Nearly $873 million was recaptured, meaning that grantees did not meet the required expenditure threshold and they did not voluntarily reallocate funds. Next slide. Treasury also released data on the first round of ERA2 reallocation. So just over $518 million was reallocated, with 69% reallocated to other grantees within the same state. 31% of the funds were reallocated to grantees outside of the state. The 5 grantees that reallocated the most funds were all state grantees and listed in the table on the right. While these grantees reallocated a large amount of funds, the vast majority of these funds remained in the same state. So for example, all the funds reallocated from the state grantee in Wisconsin, Louisiana, and Alabama were given to local grantees. Next slide. Reallocated ERA1 funds have gone to over 290 state, local, and tribal grantees, and reallocated ERA2 funds have gone to over 70 state and local grantees. Grantees which received ERA1 funds have until December 2022 to obligate these funds. Considering what reallocated ERA1 and ERA2 funds, the 5 grantees that received the most funds are the state of California, receiving $399 million, the state of New York receiving over $282 million, the state of New Jersey receiving over $167 million, the state of Texas receiving over $124 million, and the city of Indianapolis, which received over $93 million. Next slide. Just as a reminder that NLHC continues to track ERA spending on the ERA dashboard and spending tracker, which are linked here. And we will also continue to analyze reallocation as Treasury releases additional information. If you're interested in more information on reallocation or have a question, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.
Great work and helpful overview, Sophie. Thank you so much for joining and for sharing today. I'll turn now to our first field update, which comes from David Heisterkamp, who is, oh, no, okay, sorry, my mistake. Looks like Laura Mitchell is our first field update. She's the Executive Director with the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition. Laura, thanks for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm here to provide a little bit of update. We are a membership organization in Maine. We have about 140 members from developers, banks, investors, construction, architecture, et cetera, advocacy, and we advocate for the production and preservation of affordable housing. And I am new in the executive director position as of this spring, and we launched a new approach to developing policy priorities for the organization. Are my slides there or not? No, that's fine. I just wanted to see. So I'll just share a little bit about our process and refer you to our homeformepledge.com website. If you want to take a quick peek at that, that's homeformepledge.com. So we began last spring with a member survey about what folks, our members, thought should be our policy priorities. We interviewed other organizations around Maine and nationally that are in this realm, what their priorities should be for Maine, and then looked at best practices around the nation about policies that could increase the supply of housing. Because from the NLHC report, we knew that we were 20,000 units behind in housing for extremely low income Mainers. So we pared that down by the board to about 10 different potential policy priorities. We launched a brand new policy committee with board members and member organizations. And we came up with 4 key areas of legislative work that we wanted to highlight and get legislators engaged in early, not just those that were elected, but those candidates that were also running for office and out talking with their constituents. So we launched a series of postcards, and the topics of those can be found at that homeformepledge.com website. So we're just getting out the last postcard now before election season with 4 kind of key solutions that from a policy perspective can help increase housing in Maine. We want to impact local zoning and have a statewide affordable housing appeals board. So NIMBY can be reduced in our state because we know that's a problem. So that was solution 1. Solution 2 was passing a housing infrastructure bond. We believe that housing is critical infrastructure for our state, and that we need to pass a major bond for that as transportation, bridges, and road bonds are passed. And we want to be able to leverage existing buildings and state land for housing. There's not a workable kind of and usable process for that right now that is actually being taken advantage of. inclusive in that might be turning some of commercial properties into housing. We know offices are being consolidated and there's parking lots that could be better used. So that's part of what we're talking about for that solution. And then finally, we had a major win last legislative session where ADUs were allowed and throughout the state in single family zones and duplexes and even up to 4 units in growth areas in towns. And so we really want to incentivize people to take advantage of that and help pay for their own mortgage by adding this accessory dwelling unit or just add to the stock of housing. And so we're working with the Finance Authority of Maine and banks to offer low interest loans, which is considerably lower now than what the current interest rates are. And with a state match program, so we can incentivize people to take advantage of that. And we have our website for legislators and people on the campaign trail to sign. And so we're identifying who those legislative champions will be for each of our solution areas through that. So we already have, there's probably 200 people that this is going out to. And we have, I think we had over 50 people signed it at the last kind of check-in. So that's not the most recent number, but we're getting some good traction of people signing it. And we'll continue to follow up with people up until the legislative session begins in January. So that's a little bit of an example and an overview. I can send along some slides. They weren't able to be shared, but the website is a good way to look at it too, homeformepledge.com. So that's all.
Thanks so much, Laura. I think I saw someone share that link in the Q&A or the chat box. If not, we will, and we can send your slides out as some of the recap information. Apologies for any
all good
confusion there. There was a question about the housing infrastructure bond. Someone was asking for more details on the bond and a question on how you were able to build the support to get it through.
Well, we have not gotten it through yet. We are proposing it, but we have some good momentum with legislators that seem to be wanting to champion it or had the idea themselves and want to be on board with it. Our eyes are wide open that this could be like a 2-session initiative, but we're at a point in our state that we've never been as far as the focus and attention on this issue, and the business community is really on board that this is an issue as well. So we feel like we're coming in from a good position, and we will stay optimistic and keep working hard to make it happen.
Great. Well, we'll be rooting for you. So thanks so much, Laura, for joining, and we'd love to have you back for an update in the future. Appreciate your work and your partnership. Great. I'll turn now to our next field update, which is David Heisterkamp. He is the legal counsel for the United Native American Housing Association. David, thanks for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Diane. And we were happy and excited participants in last week's convening as well with the Erase. It was our first opportunity to meet a lot of you in person and participate with NLIHC in person. The United Native American Housing Association is a trade association of 34 tribally designated housing entities, which are the divisions of the tribal government that manage housing resources, mostly federally funded on reservations. In our case, we're kind of central in the United States. The Dakotas, Nebraska, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and Nevada are where our members are from. And they're from what we'd call land-based reservations, which mean most of our tribal members have a reservation that was either granted to them under a treaty or by another act of Congress. And so they're managing housing resources for that land base. UNAHA is also excited to be the first tribal partner in the Tribal State Coalition with NLIHC, and finding all our common interests in providing affordable housing and making sure that we don't have the housing instability that occurs in so much of the region because we're the only game in town. Recent efforts with the assistance of NLIHC on the ERA front, we were an ERA erase grant cohort participant, focused a lot on gathering data in Indian country. Data, as we all know, is hard. And in Indian country, it's easy to get lost in the noise. And our membership really feels it's important to demonstrate that tribes needed the ERA money, and they did a good job with it. And there's a continuing need for some kind of permanent solution, which is why we were at the convening last week. Along those lines, our first order of business has been to extend the tribes' use of ERA 1 funds. Tribes were included in the first round of ERA, but not in the second round of ERA. So they really are facing the end of all the ERA programs at the end of this year. As you heard Sophie update, there has been significant reallocation of ERA 1 money to tribes, especially in states that may not have put forth a lot of effort to run their own ERA programs, which are a lot of the states in the regions that we cover. And so we have tribes that have received large reallocations from those states and want to continue to run those programs until the money runs out, and have been seeking at least a 1-year extension on the Hill. We were on the Hill in September. We actually got pretty good response from a lot of the appropriators, Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, actually made it a point in her comments to say that an ERA 1 extension for tribes should be a priority for the Senate side of things, to see if we can get that done. Unfortunately, we didn't get anything in the recently extended spending bill, which runs through December 16th, and we're really hoping that they take a hard look at including it in the final spending bill. So that's a very brief, very quick update about what the tribal membership of NLIHC is doing. And like I say, we really felt like after last week, we're even more invested to continue with the rest of you to figure out how the programs work together, and whatever's unique about Indian country is not so unique that it can't be advocated for on a national level with all the rest of you.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. I really appreciate. I was so glad you were able to participate at the Erase convening. It was good to see you in person again after many, many years. And thanks for this helpful update. Appreciate your work and your partnership.
Thank you, Diane.
Take care. All right, now I'm going to turn to policy updates from our very own Sarah Sadian, Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing. I mentioned at the start of the call that we have a couple of months of advocacy left to do for some final possible opportunities to improve housing for the lowest income people through tax extenders and appropriations. So Sarah's going to give an update on the latest and more on what you can do. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Diane. We'll go ahead and get started. Go to the next slide, please. And then one after that. So really, as Diane mentioned, we see 2 major opportunities to advance housing policy between now and the end of the year. Diane had mentioned one is through appropriations and one is through tax extenders. And so I want to talk a little bit about what is at stake for both of those measures and ways that folks can engage. So Congress is now continuing the process of negotiating a final spending bill for fiscal year 2023. You may know that the fiscal year started on October 1. Congress has passed a continuing resolution to keep the government open until December 16th. And hopefully by then, final decisions will be made about how much to fund all housing and homelessness programs. I will say there is a risk, especially if the outcome of the election is very heavily in favor of Republicans, that they might feel like they want to push off decisions about the end of the year spending bill until the new year. That would be very concerning. It would mean that there's a potential that we could see a year-long CR, which would mean that funding would not be increased to keep up with inflation in these housing programs. So there's a lot that advocates can be doing between now and the end of the year. First, of course, to ensure that a final spending bill is passed and that decisions aren't kicked down the road a little bit further, and to make sure that housing programs receive the highest amount of funding that we can. There's a lot that's at stake here in those decisions about how much to fund housing programs. You may remember that the Senate bill is about $3 billion less than what the House bill would have provided. And that translates into really significant differences for key programs. One that's top of mind for us is that the House bill would provide additional rental assistance to 140,000 more households, but the Senate bill comes in much lower than that. At most, we would see an additional 5,000 households who would be able to get rental assistance through that bill. And we know that the needs are so great that we need to use every opportunity to get rental assistance to more households that are in need. Next slide. So one of the things that we're encouraging all of you to do is to weigh in with your members of Congress and to talk to them about specific programs that we see as serving households that have the greatest needs. I mentioned the expansion of housing choice vouchers. We want to see that expanded to 140,000 more households as included in the House bill. But we also want to see really robust funding for public housing, for homeless assistance grants, for legal assistance, and for competitive tribal housing funds. Next slide. So in terms of timing, like I said, we're hoping that the end of the year we'll see a final spending bill, but that means that a lot of decisions are being made before then. So now is really the most important time for you to be engaging with your members of Congress. I assume that after the election, things will move pretty quickly. And so you want to use this opportunity, especially when folks are back in their home states and districts for the election, use this time wisely to be engaging with your members of Congress. And just another note that any spending bill has to include both Republicans and Democrats, so don't leave anyone out in your engagement. Continue to reach out to all offices. But if you happen to have a member who's on either the House or Senate Appropriations Committees, you have an especially important role in the coming months. We're going to send out these slides to everybody afterwards, so you'll be able to click on those links to figure out if your members of Congress are on those committees. Next slide. The second opportunity I wanted to talk about is with tax extenders. So typically what we see is that Congress will pass a bill called a tax extenders bill that carries forward tax provisions that might be expiring at the end of the year. It's just also an opportunity for them to address other tax issues that they might want to get to. And so there is a really important opportunity with a tax extenders package to not only expand the low-income housing tax credit, but to reform it so that it better serves households that have the greatest and clearest needs, including those who are experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness. Many of you know that LIHTC is the primary source of financing for affordable housing. It's an important resource, but on its own, too often, it doesn't serve households that have the greatest needs. And so we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that that program is working as best as it can to serve households that have the greatest needs alongside an expansion. Next slide. I just wanted to reorient ourselves or put some context for why these reforms are so important. As you can see from this slide, this is data from our annual gap report. And it shows that for every 100 extremely low-income households, there are fewer than 36 homes that are affordable and available to them in the marketplace. All of our data shows that the shortage of housing overall really stems from the shortage for extremely low-income households. They're the only income group for which there is an absolute shortage of housing until and unless we address the shortage of housing for people with the lowest incomes. We can't end our housing crisis. Next slide. And likewise, as you all know, every state and community is impacted. There is no state where there's an adequate supply of housing that's affordable to people with the lowest incomes. This is a national problem, national in scope, and therefore the solution needs to be national as well. Next slide. So what are the reforms specifically that we're pushing for? Many of these reforms, or all of these reforms, I'll say, are either included in the Cantwell-Young Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act or in the House passed Build Back Better Act. These are reforms that have broad support, that have been vetted, and that need to be included. So two of them related to deeper income targeting. One is expanding the existing basis boost for developments that serve with at least 20% of their units set aside and affordable to households with extremely low incomes. Basically, what this means is that for those developments that are willing to set aside units that are affordable to these households, they can receive additional resources to help offset the costs for those developments. Likewise, we want to make sure that at least 8% of all LIHTC tax credits are geared towards these developments that are serving extremely low-income households. Next slide. We also want to make sure that marginalized communities and communities that struggle to build affordable housing have access to the resources that they need. One way to do this is by designating both rural areas and tribal nations as difficult to develop areas. Again, this would provide additional resources to make it more easy to build affordable housing in these communities. Next slide. There are other reforms that we also want to push for, although I would say the ones that I named earlier are most critical to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We want to see an end to the qualified contract loophole that allows investors to get out of affordable housing restrictions before the 30-year period required by federal law. We want to strengthen the right of first refusal, which would allow nonprofits to take over properties to keep them affordable for the long run. We want to make sure that HUD has access to IRS data so that we have a better sense of which properties are coming up towards the end of their affordable use period, so that there can be an effort in the state and local governments to preserve those units. And we want to strengthen renter protections as well. Next slide. Before I go further, I saw some comments in the chat box I just want to respond to. Of course, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition wants to use every single legislative opportunity to advance housing policy. Us focusing on the low-income housing tax credit does not mean that we're not also pushing for universal rental assistance or more funding for public housing or the National Housing Trust Fund. We're just looking at this particular opportunity with a tax extenders bill and what's possible here. So in terms of timing, again, this is likely to come up at the end of the year. We could see it pass on its own, or in the past, we've also seen it attached to an appropriations bill and pass as one giant package. So the timing is pretty similar to work on appropriations. We're engaging all members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, because we know that we'll need at least 60 votes in the Senate to see a tax extenders bill pass. And if you have members who are on the Finance Committee or Ways and Means Committee, these are the committees that oversee tax provisions. You have an especially important role in the months ahead to be engaging with them, to be talking with them about the low-income housing tax credit and about these opportunities to make it better serve the lowest income households. Next slide. So to help you in your advocacy, we have a lot of resources for you. We have a toolkit, we have new fact sheets, we have our budget chart and analysis, our state housing profiles. When you get access to this PowerPoint, you'll be able to access these resources as well. I did want to just share one new resource that just came out today. So I'm going to put that into the chat box. This is a new fact sheet that we just created, really sharing the national data about why we need to more deeply target the low-income housing tax credit. So check that out. Next slide, please. And this is a little fun activity for all of you guys. I'd love for you to take out your phones. This probably is the first time that somebody has encouraged you to multitask in a national call, but take out your phones, use that to scan this QR code, and it'll bring you to our Take Action page of our website, where you can click on different issues, click on issues related to appropriations or tax reform, and you can take action right there. To tell your members of Congress about these improvements and reforms and resources that are needed. So I'm going to encourage you guys to keep the slide up, and then I will turn it back to Diane so that folks can continue to engage.
That's the first I've seen of this QR code, and I love it. I just tried it. Very, very cool. A great presentation, Sarah. Thanks for the overview. Thanks for your work and the work of the whole policy team, for all of the resources, and the communications and field team as well for helping to get them all out. And just to reiterate what Sarah said, that one, our agenda, of course, is much bigger and broader than the specific policy items that Sarah just spoke about. But those two opportunities, appropriations and tax extenders, are our last best chance this year to increase housing resources for the lowest income people. And even those are somewhat uncertain for all the reasons Sarah said. The outcome of the election will have a lot to do with whether or not these bills happen this year. So we need to keep pushing, and we need your help with continuing to push for, one, the highest possible funding amount for new incremental vouchers through the appropriations process, and that critical reforms to ensure that the low-income housing tax credit be affordable to the extremely low-income people who need it the most, are paired with any expansion of the low-income housing tax credit program that could happen via tax extenders. So thanks very much in advance for your advocacy in the coming weeks. It's really important that we all weigh in with our members of Congress on these priority issues. So we've reached the end of our call. So I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. It's good to be back to our HoUSed campaign calls. I want to just remind you really briefly of a few upcoming webinars. Tomorrow we have our National Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition call. That happens at 2 o'clock Eastern. That is based primarily focused on recovery from hurricanes Ian and Fiona, as well as flooding in Eastern Kentucky. So that work is very important and continues, and we invite everybody to join us on that national call. There are also disaster housing recovery calls that happen on Wednesdays and Thursdays, smaller discussion group, and a group on Puerto Rico recovery from Hurricanes Maria and Fiona. If you'd like to participate in either of those, please reach out to Sarah or to Noah Patton at NLIHC, who leads our disaster housing recovery work. On Monday, October 31st, on Halloween, we'll have our next Our Homes, Our Votes webinar. So I encourage you all to join that. And then on November 7th, we'll have our next HoUSed campaign call, and we will see you all then. Please reach out for anything you need in the meantime, and take good care. Bye-bye.